The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast, silent expanse of the American South. A family on a road trip, enjoying the kind of freedom that comes with long stretches of highway and the open road. But their journey was about to take a dark turn. What should have been a peaceful escape from the daily grind quickly transformed into a nightmare that no one could have seen coming. This wasn't just a simple case of wrong place, wrong time. This was something much more dangerous, much more sinister. A black family traveling through unfamiliar territory, unaware of the storm that was brewing. The father, a man with a quiet strength and an air of calm authority, had always shielded his family from the world's harshest realities. But on this particular day, his past was about to catch up with him in a way none of them could have predicted. The moment their car was pulled over by a couple of police officers, things started to spiral. The officers, two men whose prejudices had clouded their judgment long before they ever saw the family's car, immediately made assumptions. Assumptions based on nothing more than skin color and a dangerous mix of hate and ignorance. What followed was a scene so heated, so charged with tension, that it left everyone in the area questioning what they had just witnessed. The officers were convinced they had found a reason to escalate the situation, seizing on the father's calm demeanor, seeing only defiance in his posture, not knowing who he really was. The family felt the anxiety building, the weight of injustice pressing down on them, and yet they were powerless to stop it. As the officers began to tighten their grip on the situation, something felt off. The father, calm and steady, wasn't reacting the way they expected. His responses, though polite and measured, felt calculated. The more the officers pushed, the more something about him seemed to unsettle them. Little did they know, the man they had just arrested wasn't just any father. He wasn't just a husband caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, this man, this father, had a past that was as deep and as hidden as the darkest corners of the government. He wasn't just a civilian caught in the grip of police brutality. He was a CIA agent, someone whose training had taught him how to handle far worse situations than a simple traffic stop. But there was a catch. He couldn't reveal that to the officers. Not yet. As the situation escalated, his mind raced. He knew he couldn't stay silent for too long. If he did, the consequences could be devastating, not just for him, but for his family. The officers, oblivious to who he truly was, continued to make the situation worse with every word and every move they made. His calm exterior was the only thing keeping the situation from spiraling into something much darker, much more dangerous. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, something incredible happened. The father's instincts kicked in. A simple, subtle move, a shift in his posture, a look that spoke volumes. Suddenly, the tension in the air changed. The officers, for the first time, began to second-guess their decisions. But would it be enough? Or was the situation already too far gone to turn back? In this moment of uncertainty, the family could only watch in silent horror as the reality of their circumstances set in. They weren't just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for their lives. And the father, a man who had spent his life serving his country in ways no one could ever imagine, found himself in a fight that he never expected, with stakes higher than any mission he had ever undertaken. What happens next? Will the truth come out in time? Or will this family's journey turn into a struggle for survival? The answers lie in the next chapter of this harrowing tale. But for now, they're just another family on the road, trying to survive in a world that seems to be stacked against them. And the clock is ticking. The tension in the air felt almost tangible now, the weight of the moment pressing down on every single person involved. The father, still silent, stood firm, but his mind was racing. He had been through countless operations, countless high-stakes situations, but nothing could prepare him for this. Nothing could prepare him for the moment when his family's safety, their very lives, were on the line because of the color of their skin. As the two officers continued to bark demands at him, the father's thoughts flashed back to the years of training he'd undergone, the long hours spent in dark rooms, learning to keep a steady hand even when everything around him seemed to crumble. He was trained for threats far greater than a traffic stop. He was a CIA agent, after all. His mission had always been to protect his country, to stand in the shadows, doing the work others couldn't or wouldn't do. But now, as he stood there, under the hot sun on a desolate highway, he realized that this moment, this random, cruel moment, might be the one time he couldn't rely on his training. The officers were pressing harder now, asking questions that went beyond normal procedure. They were trying to provoke him, pushing his buttons, trying to get a reaction. They saw his calm demeanor as something to break, something to control. But the father wouldn't budge. He couldn't. If he did, everything they had worked for, everything they had built as a family, would shatter in an instant. Meanwhile, the rest of the family sat in the car, watching helplessly. The mother, a strong woman who had always been the rock of their family, could barely contain her panic. She knew something was wrong. She knew this wasn't just a normal traffic stop, but she didn't know what to do. The kids, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, were huddled together in the backseat, the silence of their fear hanging thick in the air. They had always been told the world was safe, that their family was invincible. But now, in the face of the officer's aggression, that illusion was slowly crumbling. The father knew he had to act. He couldn't let them keep pushing. He couldn't let them escalate the situation any further. The officers, still shouting, were growing more and more impatient. They didn't understand why he wasn't scared, why he wasn't reacting the way they expected. Their hands hovered near their holsters now, and every second felt like it could be the one that sent everything spiraling out of control. The family had been here before in a way. The father's work had taken them to many different places, far from their home, far from the comforts of normal life. But this was different. This wasn't a mission in the field, a calculated risk. This wasn't about espionage or covert operations. This was real life. And real life, as they were learning the hard way, was often far more of unpredictable and dangerous than anything in the shadows. As the officers continued to make threats, the father's mind worked quickly. He needed a plan, and fast. But what could he do? What could he say to diffuse this, to make the officers realize that they had no idea who they were dealing with? He couldn't just tell them. He couldn't reveal who he was without risking everything. His cover, his identity, everything he had worked for could be blown in an instant. The consequences were too high, not just for him, but for the family he was trying to protect. The seconds felt like hours as the situation continued to escalate. The officers' words became more heated, their patience wearing thin. They were angry now, their racial biases clouding their judgment even more. The father knew that any wrong move on his part, any sign of resistance, could set them off. But his instincts, honed over years of training, told him not to make the first move. He had to stay calm. He had to control the situation, or it would slip beyond his grasp. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the unexpected happened. The officer, the one who had been barking orders the loudest, suddenly froze. His hand, which had been inches from his gun, stopped midair. The father's gaze locked onto the officers, a flicker of recognition in the officer's eyes. It was brief, a flash, but it was enough. The father's training kicked in. He could see the moment the officer realized he had made a mistake. He could see the shift, the doubt creeping into the officer's mind. The father didn't have to do anything. It was all in the eyes, in that single powerful glance. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The father's heart raced as he tried to read the officer's thoughts. Could the officer see it? Could he sense the truth, the danger, lurking behind the father's calm exterior? Was this enough to stop the officers from escalating the situation any further? Or had they already gone too far? The seconds stretched on, the air thick with uncertainty. The father knew they were teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. If they kept pushing, if the officers didn't back down, this could end in violence. But could he turn it around? Could he get them to listen, to see reason before it was too late? The family, locked in the car, could only hold their breath, waiting for the moment of truth. Their fate was hanging in the balance. What would happen next? Would the officers see the error of their ways? Or had the father's quiet strength already been misinterpreted as something far more dangerous? The road ahead was uncertain, but with each passing second, the situation grew more dire. The story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The moment seemed to stretch forever. The father stood there, calm, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, of protecting his family, of keeping everything they had built safe. But still, that brief exchange of glances between him and the officer, something had shifted in that instant. Was it doubt? Fear? Recognition? The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a heartbeat, the father thought it was over. Maybe, just maybe, the officer would pull back. Maybe this nightmare was about to end. But as if to confirm the father's worst fears, the officer's hand slowly drifted toward his radio. A sudden, chilling realization hit the father. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. The officer was calling for backup, escalating everything. The moment of hesitation was over, and now they were in full-blown crisis mode. The father's heart pounded in his chest, the decision now weighing heavily on him. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Before he could make his move, a sharp voice sliced through the tension, breaking the thick silence. It was the mother, her voice trembling but resolute as she shouted from the car. "Enough. We've done nothing wrong." Her words cut through the haze of fear that had overtaken them all. It was a voice of reason, but also a voice of defiance. It echoed in the ears of the officers, as if challenging them to justify their actions. The officers seemed momentarily stunned. The father's mind raced, calculating his next step. He needed to act now, before everything spiraled out of control. He glanced at the officer who had been the most aggressive, noticing a slight flicker of hesitation. It was a crack in the armor. The father made his move, his voice steady but commanding. "This is a mistake. I'm asking you one more time. Let us go." Something in his tone must have struck the right chord, because for the first time, the officers hesitated. They stood there, frozen, as if unsure of how to proceed. In that split second, the father made a decision. He would take the risk. It was the only way to end this. "I'm not just anyone," the father said, his voice low but firm. "I'm a CIA agent." The words hit the air like a bombshell, and for a moment, everything went still. The officers froze, their expressions shifting from aggression to confusion, to something else entirely. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the calm, ordinary-looking man in front of them to be someone with such a high-stakes, high-level identity. The shift in their demeanor was palpable. The officer with the radio looked at his partner, and the two exchanged a tense glance. It was clear now that they had no idea how to handle this. But before they could make another move, the mother, still brimming with anger, spoke up again. "You don't get to treat us this way, not because of our skin, not because of your hate," she said, her words echoing in the sudden quiet. Her courage, her strength, rippled through the father, bolstering him with the energy he needed to hold his ground. The officers, now visibly rattled, stepped back. The sound of sirens approached in the distance, but the father knew it was too late for them to back out now. They had already crossed a line. With his family watching, he did the unthinkable. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his CIA identification. His fingers were steady, but his heart raced as he showed the badge to the officers. The realization hit them, and the shift in their eyes was undeniable. The father wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a man caught in a routine traffic stop. He was a trained agent with connections far beyond their power. A tense silence hung in the air as the officers took a step back, clearly shaken. The sound of the approaching sirens was no longer a sign of backup. It was a sign of retreat. The father's identity had forced them to recalibrate their actions. The officers muttered something about needing to check in and quickly moved away, avoiding eye contact, their previous bravado gone. The family sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. The father, though relieved, felt a storm of emotions brewing inside him. The injustice of the situation, the fear he had seen in his family's eyes, the anger that still simmered under his calm exterior, it all collided in a rush. The worst was over, but the scars would remain. The officer who had been the most aggressive glanced back at them once more, his face a mixture of guilt and anger. He didn't say a word, but it was clear that the encounter had changed him. He had seen something he didn't understand, something that had forced him to confront his own biases, his own assumptions. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a small crack in the wall of prejudice that many like him had built around their minds. The family drove away, the road stretching out ahead of them once again, but it felt different now. The father's hands tightened around the wheel as he navigated the highway, his mind still reeling from the intensity of what had just happened. The mother sat quietly beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, a silent reassurance. The kids, for the first time in what felt like forever, seemed to relax a little, though the weight of the experience was not lost on them. They would never forget this moment, the moment when everything they thought they knew about their country, their safety, and their place in the world had been challenged. But the father knew one thing for sure. This wouldn't be the last time they faced such a challenge. The world had a way of throwing the unexpected at you, of testing your limits. And in the face of that, they would be ready. They would never stop fighting for their freedom, for their dignity, and for their place in a world that seemed so often to want to tear them down. As they continued down the highway, the story of that day lingered in their hearts. A story of fear, courage, and the harsh realities of living in a world where assumptions can have deadly consequences. But through it all, they had survived. And that, in itself, was a victory.